Hi, my name is Nate. I'm a social worker in Southern California. I work with a lot of homeless people and mentally ill people, and I am making this presentation to try to add some context and information about my experiences and things I've researched about working with this population in order to just improve overall awareness and to assist providers with having a more thoughtful discussion about the needs of this population. Thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to comment if you have any questions, and let's get a discussion going about what would better serve this population. Thank you. Homeless trauma, the chronically homeless population, and the psychology of trauma. So, the purpose of this presentation is to discuss the chronically homeless, the trauma they experienced, in order to provide better context about their situations. The reason for that is because historically this is a very underserved population, and it's really necessary that there is more education around the histories and the psychology of the individuals being served in order to improve those services. As I said in the introduction, this is a population, the chronically homeless, that I personally work with as a social worker. But throughout my adult life, I've volunteered and done outreach work in a variety of contexts. Um, a lot of what I'm going to be sharing is peer reviewed research and different journalism articles, but another good chunk of it is anecdotal from my personal professional experience. My target audience, truthfully, is professionals that work as service providers for the homeless population. But this is such a dramatically underserved population that I think this is a topic worth discussing for anybody. There are homeless people in every community in this country, if not the world over. And I think that it's important that we have more insightful discussions, more well informed discussions about them. Now, every homeless person's needs and experiences are different, so no two people are alike, no two interventions or approaches are alike, but I think some of the larger general themes I'll be discussing will be applicable to large swaths of the chronically homeless population. So, who is considered chronically homeless? The text in this slide is a direct quote from the government's McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. This is a federal act that defines chronically homeless in a variety of ways. But basically, to paraphrase it, it's meant to describe anybody who resides in a place not meant for human habitation. They've been residing in that place for approximately 12 out of the last 36 months, and has a documented disability. And this can be a variety of disabilities ranging from mental illness to substance use, developmental PTSD, cognitive impairments, or just physical disabilities, chronic physical illnesses. And as a service provider, I've seen every single one of these in multitude, and they present differently in every single person. Um, Now, the way that the definition of chronically homeless is defined, any interruptions in homelessness can be documented, but as long as they are in a uninhabitable place for 12 out of 36 months, they are considered chronically homeless. The photograph here is of a park in the community that I actually do work in. It is literally tarps over shopping carts, bike parts, pallets, sleeping bags. It is not a construction, more of like a lean-to or a tent type deal, just in the middle of a public park. And this is very common where I work. I see lots of these types of temporary sort of dwellings. The textbook definition of what constitutes fit for human habitation, there's a difference between how it's defined in tenants' rights and landlord rights documentation for lessees and tenants, but For homeless people, when we're talking about what constitutes fit for human habitation, it really is just basic stuff like running water, sewage, heat. Um, so people living in a car are considered homeless, not fit for human habitation. People living in RVs, but only RVs without hookups. If it's an RV park, that's considered housed. Hotel or motels, as long as it's 30 or 29 or less days, that's considered homeless. But once that 30-day mark hits, they are considered to be interrupted in their homelessness. Not necessarily housed, but just their homelessness has been interrupted. Shelters and treatment centers are coded in such a way that they are allowed to be considered homeless while receiving services in a place like that for up to 90 days or 89 days or less. And because of the lifestyle of being on the street, you see a lot of accumulated debris and items outside of these dwellings. They're just sort of they tend to build on themselves in a sort of evolving way. They're never really built with like a construction or an intention in mind. They're all sort of just made up as they go along. And I don't mean that to sound critical, it's just that they're all temporary, whether they are meant to be or not. The police, emergency services, street cleaning crews come by and regularly remove them, take them down, or they're just abandoned or kind of capitalized on by other homeless folks. So some years ago, California tried to legalize a quote homeless bill of rights. This is on the state's legislative website. You can read the full text of it. Basically, it was an acknowledgement of California's, well, not just California, but American history in California of segregating, oppressing, and vilifying homeless people. It cited Jim Crow laws as an example of this, anti-Okie laws, which was laws against poor people basically moving across state lines. Sundown town ordinances, meaning like people weren't allowed to be out on the street after sundown, vagrancy laws. These were all like local and municipal ordinances meant to discriminate against homeless people, to discourage them from residing in those communities. The modern day equivalent of it is a quality of life ordinance, and that's designed to basically exclude homeless people from jurisdictions. So, as Americans, you have a constitutional right to your life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you're homeless, you're within those rights and you don't have a reason to be harassed by police necessarily. And so they have to have these ordinances in place about quality of life in order to justify the intervention of law enforcement as a means of excluding the homeless people from those communities. For example, homeless people in gated communities are immediately removed and considered to be trespassing, even though they might be on a public walkway or something like that, because there is likely to be a quality of life ordinance in a lot of those municipalities. Homeless people have, for a very, very long time, and currently, been the target of discriminatory policing and legislative practices in general. What this basically amounts to is public resources in the form of police officers and first responders being used as a way of relocating with the intention of removing, although that never really is how it pans out, but relocating away from public view the homeless population. Aside from how absurd that actually is in reality, it's incredibly impractical and very, very expensive. It's incalculable how much resources are being utilized simply to exclude homeless people. I'll have a little bit more on that later. I want to show the specifics of that in the community I serve. So this is a chart from Social Finance. They did a partnership study with Ventura County, where I work, and this is the 2017-18 fiscal year, and it's basically taking the documentable homeless population, meaning the people that are already screened into at least one service, homeless provider service, and it's looking at the 140 highest utilizers of that population. So it's about 2,500 people, and they've narrowed it down to the highest 25% of the people that are utilizing at least one service over the course of 2 or more years. So these are considered the highest utilizers in the county. These 140 people in that fiscal year cost the county of Ventura between $5 and $8 million just in what's billed to them. Not that they can pay it, but billed to them in the form of health care, behavioral health services, jail, EMS, and COC stands for Continuum of Care Services. So I actually think this is an incredibly low estimate. When you break down these numbers, it's saying that EMS was costing an average of like $380 per person. In reality, I've personally seen one homeless person take multiple ambulances to the emergency room per week. These 140 high utilizers are perpetually in and out of the emergency room. The one individual furthest to the left, the highest spike on there, I believe had a hospital bill of almost $250,000 that year, throughout the year, of just trying to get health needs met. It averaged out to around $37,000 per person of this 140 highest individuals. Now, every homeless person on this list is not a chronically homeless person, and not every person out of this 2,500 group of documentable service recipients is utilizing an exorbitant amount of services. Some are actually experiencing homelessness for the first time and are getting directed toward support that is going to end that for them. I'm more focusing on the chronically homeless extreme end of that spectrum. So, for example, these 140 individuals are using millions and millions of dollars per year of services simply to remain homeless. The likelihood of these people's homelessness ending is somewhat low based on their physical and mental health needs. And what I'm going to start explaining, it has a lot to do with trauma they've incurred throughout their lives. I personally find this graphic a little startling. I mean, to think about the amount of services being funneled to these folks who are desperately in need of it is just shocking to me. I know that from my working with local law enforcement, they know many of these people on a first name basis. They have known them for years. They are familiar with their patterns and resources, or lack thereof, and are trying to conceptualize a way of breaking their cycles. But as I will go into, it is not so simple as it sounds. So there is an article by Malcolm Gladwell called Million Dollar Murray, and it's a story about a homeless man from Reno named Murray Barr, who over the course of 10 years, they sort of calculated that he used about $1 million in emergency services, just in emergency room bills alone, not even counting the police intervention and the emergency services. And I don't want to be like cruel, but the collateral damage homeless people out on the street tend to cause, just in public damage, property damage, theft, and whatnot. The quote that jumped out at me from this article was by the police officer that happened to spend a lot of his career intervening with Murray. It cost us $1 million to not do something about Murray. Now, I think that's an oversimplification. I'm sure there was a lot of resources thrown at Mr. Murray, and he was unable to receive them for a variety of reasons. The article does go into say he was a veteran with a lot of trauma and very severe alcoholism. He did end up passing away from that condition, but I think it is a very easy thing to assume that nobody's doing anything about the people that we see on the streets, the really low functioning, chronically homeless people, when in reality, there's a lot being done for them. It's not so simple as just to offer them a carrot on a stick and hope that they follow you. There's a lot going on with internally within them that makes it difficult for them to access services. Malcolm Gladwell's article does talk about Murray going into a drug and alcohol treatment program and was very successful for a long time, I think almost a year. And then when he was exited from the program, because he was successful, he was not able to sustain a long term solution and returned to the streets and relapsed in a pretty short period of time. I've seen patterns like that with many, many people. It begs the question: what does it actually take with these chronic homeless people, what some people call the hardcore homeless? What does it actually take to make a lasting change in their pattern? But before you can really go into talking about what works in order to break somebody's pattern of self destruction, you have to understand why it's there in the first place. So now we're going to talk about the other part of the presentation, which is trauma. So we're going to specifically at this point talk about childhood trauma that leads to homelessness. I read a lot of clinical research on this. There's a lot more clinical research about trauma than there is about homelessness specifically, but I tried to find as best I could where the overlaps were. So from a neurocognitive standpoint, there is a lot of research that suggests that adverse childhood experiences, which are abuse and neglect and other forms of trauma, do correlate to cognitive decline, functioning decline in terms of executive ego functioning and memory issues specifically. This sort of chart I have on here is from a pretty informative article, and it breaks down the basic interaction between different parenting factors that are reversed, neglect and abuse, and different environmental factors, which can be considered macro, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, what resources exist in your community. These are like impersonal, as well as things that are being directed to the person, which are things like nutrition, family, violence, genetics, and the outcomes of those things. Now, these are all interactive spheres. These are not mutually exclusive. So I don't want it to sound like it's a cause and effect thing. This is all stuff that's interacting with each other all the time. But the biological stress of growing up with a lot of these factors adversely working against you does inhibit different biochemical function, which leads to adverse brain development, prefrontal cortex dysfunctions, limbic system dysfunctions. The outcome in the lower right-hand corner is what I'm drawing attention to: the compromised neurocognitive and psychosocial outcomes, literally a lower IQ and achievement levels. There's also just different psychopathological behavioral issues that are the result of these childhood experiences as well. But this research specifically talks about cognitive functioning and adverse childhood experiences being a contributor to inhibited cognitive functioning. So what does this actually mean? It means that a large number of people we see with lower cognitive functioning might have had adverse childhood experiences that contributed to that condition. When I work with my adults that have cognitive issues or perhaps lower IQs even, it does kind of beg the question of what is contributing to that condition within them that may have been there since childhood. And of course, any trauma researcher will tell you that some traumas contribute to the occurrences of other traumas. For example, drug users are 7 times more likely than non-users to become homeless. And it's been shown that substance misuse tends to increase after becoming homeless. That's all pretty logical. That stands to reason. Um, Now, the extreme of the adverse health effects you see in homeless individuals are not just mental health, but significantly lower mortality rates from every single study observing these types of things. Oftentimes, with the chronically homeless population, it's very difficult to perform a reliable study. So one has to a lot of this research is pulling from city records, coroner stuff, rather than the direct service workers or the homeless people themselves. It's just a very difficult thing to pull off longitudinal studies with large scale populations of a very constantly moving, constantly physically moving and shifting population. But the reason I wanted to include these extremes is because um, I wanted to convey how physically and mentally damaging it is to sleep outside in a dangerous setting. Um, it's a very every person I've worked with that's been on the streets for any amount of time will tell you it is very traumatizing. The physical toll of living in an uninhabitable space is extreme. There's a lack of medical attention, a lack of access to hygienic resources, toilets, running water, soap, showers, which are all highly likely to exacerbate health concerns. I see a lot of chronic infections. I see a lot of damage to skin, to feet. Um, there is within the homeless community there is a severely high incident rate of assault, domestic violence. You do see families and partners, people trying to have relationships while on the streets. Domestic violence is significantly higher with them. Rape is significantly higher among the homeless population. Many of the women I've worked with talk about living in constant fear of being raped while they're trying to sleep out on the streets. Almost every single homeless person I've talked to has been the victim of theft and robbery. As a result of that, many of them don't have vital documents. Most of them are missing IDs, and um, when you don't have a photo ID, you can't access a variety of other health services. Many of the housing programs require you to not only have a valid photo ID, but also a social security card, a physical birth certificate, and a whole slew of other documentation about, you know, the very least a tuberculosis screening. And if you don't have an ID, you really don't have the ability to obtain any of those other things. Being homeless on the streets also involves constant police interactions, not necessarily harassment, although it's absolutely historically true. And that definitely still goes on, but not every police interaction is harassment. A lot of times they are trying to help and get people into services. I think the local law enforcement are actually becoming one of the largest referrals to the behavioral health system. Um, there is also the reality of just constant discrimination and harassment and isolation for looking homeless, which you really can't help to do if you're chronically homeless. Um, this would if you think about what that implies, it really speaks to like not being able to access, for example, the bathrooms. You go into a convenience store and ask to use the bathroom, they take one look at you and tell you to go away because you're homeless, you look homeless, you smell homeless. And so they don't want you messing up their bathroom, they kick you out, and then you're further antagonized from having access to those resources. So the result of all, I consider all those things to be further traumatic, on top of any other traumas that somebody might have experienced prior to their homelessness. The result of these things is, in a documented sense, much higher incidence to the general population of self-harm and suicidality, drug and alcohol abuse, um, emergency service utilization. I can't emphasize that enough. Many of the police officers and first responders in the community I work in, but also anywhere I've really been and talked to and spent any time in, will tell you that working with the homeless population, responding to the homeless population, is an inordinately high amount of their job. Sometimes I've had EMTs tell me that's 50% of their calls are going to respond to homeless issues. Emergency hospitalizations, or just being inpatient hospitalized because of the physical health conditions that are antagonized by being homelessness. The legal system, incarceration. I've had people be incarcerated for having a violation of an ordinance against a permitless building. So now this would be a person that is now in jail because they were living in a little pallet house out on the railroad tracks, or off into the bushes or under a bridge. That is a public. I consider the legal system to be a resource for the community, and to think about that resource being used to penalize somebody for living in that manner is kind of absurd to me. All of this stuff coagulates into a chronic refusal of services with that high utilizing population. It's very hard to get them to say yes to services because they've been, for lack of a better word, repeatedly traumatized by all of the circumstances that they're subjected to every day. And that refusal of services is really the hurdle that we are, as providers, constantly discussing with the chronically homeless population. So how do we begin to heal the complex trauma that these individuals have experienced? It's very elaborate, but to be simplistic, we need to start at the root of it. So I tend to encourage people to consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs first and foremost. If you're trying to help somebody, you have to consider how hard it is when you are deprived of your access to different things on the hierarchy of needs. The basic physiological needs that you find on Maslow's hierarchy, food, water, warmth, rest, physiological needs, are a daily struggle for the chronically homeless population. So when we're looking at how do we help address those chronically experienced traumas, you have to then wonder about how to provide those basics like physiological needs in a consistent way. The consistent access to those things is what begins to slowly chip away at the trauma that they've incurred. And then, of course, it goes up the food chain to the safety and security needs. I think those have to go tandem with the physiological needs. And by allowing them access to those services that provide those needs, you can start to see some healing take place. It's very slow, though. I consider attachment theory as well. If you're working with children, for example, and you're working toward helping somebody have a secure attachment, as a caregiver, you have to maintain a lot of consistency and patience. You build trust, you build openness to them, and it's the same thing with the chronically homeless population. They are volatile by nature, and you as a provider or a member of the community are best served by an approach that is going to reflect that of a very patient caregiver trying to help a very challenging child. Now, it's not fair to think of these people like children. That's not accurate. But in theory, attachment styles should be considered. How do you bring about a secure attachment with an anxious or avoidant child? That's really what's on the table here. I've found a good approach is to consider, when can I bring a service to them? This is a group of people who tend to avoid services, but if you make accessing it incredibly easy, there is a much higher likelihood they'll consistently access it. So, for example, AA meetings, it's very difficult for them to go to AA meetings. But if you bring an AA meeting to a place where they are likely to be, there is just a simply higher likelihood they'll participate. So asking like when you can bring a service to them, that's always going to mitigate that service refusal pattern. I want to include this quote: people who are really struggling with mental illness and substance abuse, it's hard for them to fully participate in their treatment, comply to their medications, that is very true, when they don't have their own personal safety or place to be. We have very limited year-round shelter programs in Ventura County, and struggle with the high cost, low vacancy rental market to find people appropriate housing. That's Tara Caruth. She's the manager of the VC Continuum of Care, whose meetings I participate in pretty regularly. Um, that's an understatement, I would say. Many people, including the not homeless population, struggle with the high cost, low vacancy rental market. But when we're talking about putting a homeless person in a place that is no longer the streets, meaning not a temporary situation, we have to consider the housing market in general. And boy, in Southern California, that is not a very easy conversation. That being said, though, what is the housing approach? As a provider group in this location, we have adopted a housing first approach. So historically, um, housing services were offered to homeless people that were already readily accepting services, drug and alcohol counseling, medical case management. And what was found over time was that that was actually a very small number of people that were able to readily access those services. So the housing first philosophy has been introduced. It's turned into a much more humanitarian approach. Basically, the idea is, regardless of somebody's ability to maintain it healthily, you offer them permanent, supportive, stable housing, and by having access to that, they are able to then access services, drug and alcohol counseling, mental health, whatever else they need. I have seen that a lot. I have seen the ability for somebody to have a lock on a door, to have the privacy that entails, is a humongously relieving factor to them. It allows them to really start a mental health healing process that they just would not be able to do unless they had a safe place to be. So even though they might be a chronically mentally ill person, having the ability to have a safe, private space to be actually becomes a healing attribute in their overall health and recovery. Um, I always want to speak about trauma informed care as well. That's a very important factor in providing services to homeless people. Um, this is basically a guiding philosophy for professionals, but I think it's important just for anybody that interacts with homeless people to kind of keep these values in mind. I think it's something I want to boil down to safety and dignity first. When I'm sort of contemplating the services I offer as a professional, I always want to ask, like, how do I maintain the safety for this individual, and how do I offer them a sense of dignity? Dignity is very important. It's I consider it to be a human right, and so when contemplating how best to offer a service, what should our service look like? Whether you're providing food service, housing service, medical services, it's always a very productive question to ask. Will this bring about a sense of dignity? Will they feel like a peer or an equal or a fellow human being through by virtue of being able to access this service? That's a really important question. So having a trauma-informed care approach assumes that this person may have experienced a significant amount of trauma throughout their life, and that it's up to us to be mindful of that when trying to help them. So that concludes this presentation. I know I threw a lot of information out there about what constitutes chronically homeless. I would like people to kind of think about a person they might see on their commute or on a highway off ramp, or maybe even just have seen pictures of tents under overpasses and thought, I wonder what they must be going through, and that this presentation offered some information about what that might be like. Now, I said at the beginning this was sort of geared toward homeless service providers. So I think the conversation should really be amongst providers. How can we better serve the population of homeless people in our community? Every community has diverse needs. Every homeless person has diverse needs. So, how do we be mindful of that? How do we be mindful of the traumas that they've been through or that they're currently incurring and help them end the cycle of homelessness? I think another big factor of that is how do we engage the community on the behalf of the homeless people? How do we gain the support of people who don't understand this? And I want to offer this information in this presentation for the broader community, for people that might never have interacted with a homeless person directly or healthily. So, how do we engage the community on the behalf of the homeless population? Finally, I think it's important to have a discussion about just the idea of solving homelessness. I know that's a really idealistic thing. I hold it in my mind that it is possible. However, it's not something any one person or service can offer. The needs of this population are very elaborate, and I think as long as we're willing to be creative and patient and bear in mind the context in which we're working, there are productive solutions. Thank you so much for your time in watching this presentation. I am very grateful to have the opportunity to do this work and to share my experiences with other people. Please feel free to comment below and provide me with any feedback you can. I'd be very happy to hear other people's experiences and thoughts on the subject. Again, in my opinion, we can't be discussing this enough. This is something that we should be talking about as often with as many people as we can. So, again, thank you very much and be safe.